All right. So we've got a couple more methods, case studies, observations, and experiments to get through. So let's jump into the case study. This would be sort of the granddaddy and, back into antiquity, the way of collecting data. Freud was the first person who really attempted this method. And this is where you study one individual in really great depth. I've got a nice picture of Sigmund Freud here because this is the way that he did all of his so-called research. I'm not sure that we could really call what he did per se research because he never went the next level. He would just start interpreting. And so I'm not exactly sure what to say about that. But one of the biggest problems with the case study is researcher expectancy effects. And anybody who knows anything about Freud, one of the big complaints about him is that he described behavior and labeled behavior through his lens of what he expected people to be talking about, or what his theory said should be governing their behavior. And so because of that, he might have been incorrect in his interpretations of, why a person acted the way they did, or how they acted, or all those questions that he was supposed to be asking. It's almost like he already knew what would motivate someone. And so he would ask questions that would help to support the interpretation that he's already made. For example, he had a case called Little Hans who had a phobia of black-faced horses. And through, working with Freud and going through some psychoanalytic, kind of free association, other kinds of things, Freud was ultimately able to make the conclusion that the reason why he was afraid of black-faced horses is because his stepfather had a black beard and he was scared of his stepfather. And that once upon a time, little Hans had seen a horse fall down in the street. So he sort of transferred his black-faced, stepfather fears onto the black horse. So I'm just going to say that not all of us would necessarily spend time talking to little Hans and come to that conclusion, right? There are probably other questions that we might ask and other things that we might explore, because maybe we aren't carrying with us this expectation that it's always going to come back to, something having to do with sex and having to do with, fears and aggressions and all the things that Freud always fell back on as his explanations. So with the case study, whatever our individual biases might be as a researcher might guide what kinds of questions we ask the participants. So I mentioned before, being a cognitive psychologist, I'll always fall down on the side of that. So if I had a person who I was doing a case study on, I might do a bunch of memory tests and psychomotor tests where I ask them to maybe, manipulate some knobs or move some pegs around, or I might ask them to do some kind of timed activity where they have to, find objects in an array of other objects, or I might do things that are very cognitive looking because I'm going to come in with my pre-established bias that it's going to be something cognitive, right? Whereas Freud comes in with his researcher expectancy that it's going to be something having to do with sex and aggression. So we have to be really careful when we read case studies that the person who conducted it might have had, some kind of bias that caused them to only ask the kinds of questions that would lead to their conclusion. The other thing we have to be aware of with case studies is that we're looking at one or maybe a couple people who have something in common that may not really represent the average person, right? It's what we call anecdotal evidence. If you only have one or just a couple people, that's not enough data for us to really, draw conclusions. So I found this meme that shows the plural of anecdote is not data. Right? You can't say, well, now I have two anecdotes, so now I have data. Not really, because if you're seeking out certain kinds of information deliberately, you're not doing the kind of sampling and stuff that we expect to see in actual science, right? So what you're doing is just collecting anecdote after anecdote after anecdote, which is what Freud did. He would just get more patients, and do psychoanalysis on them. And then he would fit their stories and their symptoms and their experiences all into this same, model that he had just developed, and he'd go, hey, yet another person who supports my interpretations, when in fact it might have been faulty interpretations. So when we look at case studies, they can be super informative. They can kind of tell us about what might be a problem that we want to explore in another way. So for example, there was a beautiful case study that was conducted in Baltimore on, it was 5 or 6 prostitutes working in Baltimore. And it's really difficult to get prostitutes to talk to researchers. They're skeptical. They might get punished by their pimp. There are a lot of reasons why they don't want to participate. And so for him to be able to get 5 or 6 of them to talk to him was actually a big get. You know what I mean? It was like really a lot. And so it gives you at least a window into the kinds of things that at least a prostitute in Baltimore might say. And his study actually has provided for us a basic model of the kinds of factors that can lead to prostitution, having to do with, upbringing and, context at home and other, drug use and other kinds of things that all kind of come together. And we'll talk about this more in the chapter on sex for sale. But the idea is, with just a few participants, we can at least start to say, okay, these are questions that we need to ask because, 3 out of the 5 said the same thing or something like that. And so we like case studies because they give us like maybe some basic principles that we need to be doing research on. We also like case studies, especially on things that happen that are universal effects. Like we use case studies for studying sleep and dreaming all the time because everybody sleeps. Pretty much anybody who's woken up during REM sleep will report a dream. So it's one of those sort of universal behaviors that means you don't have to study everybody to really understand the principles. And with certain topics, it makes a lot of sense to do case studies. And absolutely, it makes a lot of sense with certain populations who maybe the condition that they have is really rare or their willingness to talk to a researcher is really rare. So they really are useful. It's just we wouldn't want to stop with them. Usually if we have case study evidence that's pointing us in a particular direction, then we're going to escalate to the next level, which would be to do an observation. There are different ways to do observations. There are clinical observations, which is what Masters and Johnson did with the penile strain gauge and the vaginal plethysmograph that I described before. This is a picture of those 2 items. You can see that you've got the computer, so to speak, tied to it. On the right in the front is, I don't know if you guys can see my arrow when I point at it, but on the right here, the black and white object, that's the vaginal plethysmograph, and it would be inserted into the vagina. You see a blood pressure measurement. And then the penile strain gauge is this little circular thing, and that would go around the penis and detect what we call engorgement, blood flow to the penis. Engorgement in the vagina also would be picked up by the vaginal plethysmograph. Anyway, in the clinical observation, you actually have the respondents come into the clinic, right, into the lab in this case, and they are observed in that clinical setting. So the observer has control over the setting, which is an advantage, right? We don't have distractions. I'm not in your house, you're in mine, so I have control over everything. And so we can get more trustworthy results when it's being conducted in the lab. So they might be more reliable, but then some people complain that the results might not be valid because you might be behaving strangely because you're in the lab, right? Like this isn't your normal behavior. You might be behaving like this because you're in the clinic. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I go to visit the doctor, I don't act like my normal self in that clinical setting, right? Because I'm nervous or whatever. And so you can imagine that we might have reliable findings, but maybe not necessarily valid findings. People might not be behaving like their normal self in the clinic. So there are other ways to do observations that are maybe less reactive, where the person might behave more naturally in those settings. One method is called participant observation. And there was a report published in 1970 by Humphreys, he called it the tea room trade. And what he was interested in is impersonal sex in public places, particularly bathrooms. And he was interested in gay men having quick anonymous sex in bathrooms and forests and stuff like that. If you stop at a rest stop, oftentimes people will go off into the forest, stuff like that. So he was interested in that, like who does it, what characteristics they have, things like that. So he engaged in what's called a participant observation, which means that he participated in the observation and he presented himself as just a regular member of the environment, right? So having quick anonymous sex in the bathroom is actually illegal. It's considered a lewd and lascivious act. And so you can get, it's a misdemeanor crime, but you can get fined and stuff like that. There might even be some jail time in certain jurisdictions. And so generally there's somebody who acts as the lookout in case the police are coming. And then there are the people who engage in the sex act, usually inside of like a bathroom stall or like I said, out in the forest or something like that. So he had a research assistant who apparently was willing to engage in the sex acts. And that person would go into the stall at the rest stop, and he would do, I guess, what is the universal signal of I'm interested, which is shut the stall door. And then if somebody knocks on it, instead of saying occupied, you say come in. And so then they would engage in whatever sex act. And Humphrey's job was to act as the lookout and make sure that nobody was coming. And so he and his research assistant just sort of presented themselves as people in the bathroom that were, appropriate targets for this behavior. And then what Humphreys did that made this implementation of the participant observation very ethically questionable is that he didn't tell the participants that he was doing research at any point. He never said anything about that. And as they left the bathroom, he would watch them and see what car they got into, and he would write down their license plate number. And then he would go to the public records and he would find out who owned that car. And then he would assume that whoever owned the car was the person who had been in the bathroom, which is a huge assumption, right? And then he would look up characteristics of that person. Like, do they own a business? Are they married? Other kinds of public record kind of information about the person, including their address. And then he would go to their house, and under the guise of a completely unrelated survey, he'd ask them a bunch of questions. And they had no idea that he was the same guy who had been at the bathroom. So he took what is considered a kind of semi-unethical strategy, which is, participant observation anyway, right? Engaging in activities with people, and they don't know that they're being the target of research. That's kind of questionable anyway. But then he really upped it a couple of notches by, going into the public record and going to their houses. And now we've moved into kind of creepy. And so he published his results. And what was interesting about his results was that he found that the average person who was engaging in this activity, the average male who was engaging in this activity, was actually married, was in positions of respect in the community, and they didn't want to lose that, and they were concerned. They had very negative attitudes about homosexuality as revealed by their responses on the survey. So they had sort of this, conflict between how they saw themselves but how they actually felt and stuff like that. Humphreys was quite the target of, attacks for being so unethical, but he always said, there's no way I could have gotten this information any other way. And he's completely right. He couldn't have. But a lot of people were like, but is that the point? So yeah, this was quite questionable back in 1970, what he did. The other type of observation is purely naturalistic, where you as the researcher try to just blend into the environment and you observe behaviors that are happening completely out in public with no expectation of privacy present, stuff like that. So like Fraley and Shaver did a study of people saying goodbye at the airport. And, they had to kind of guess what the relationships must have been based on the behaviors of the people saying goodbye at the airport. But these are the kinds of things that we can do. Now, the tricky part with naturalistic research is that it's kind of hard to blend into the background and have people not notice that you're actually watching people or taking notes or doing the other things. And that could cause them to alter their behavior. Right. And so we want to make sure that they're behaving as naturally as they can. And we don't want to be a factor that causes them to behave unnaturally. A lot of times I'll have students say that they want to do some research and they're just going to do an observation. And I always cringe when they say, I'm just going to do an observation, because there's a lot of planning and preparation that has to go into a naturalistic observation or any of these types of observation. You have to know exactly what you're looking for. You have to figure out how you're going to record instances of that behavior? Like, are you going to have a little checklist? What if a behavior that you didn't expect is emitted and you don't have it on your checklist and there's not time to write it? And what if you're looking down writing something and a really critical behavior occurs and you miss it? There's so many things that can go wrong with naturalistic observation. What if the participants notice you? Like, how are you going to play this off as not an observation? And then there are the ethical questions with naturalistic observation. It's like, well, yeah, we're out in public, but I didn't expect for my behavior to be being recorded by some creeper who's watching me. So, there's a big debate in psychology about whether it really is okay to be observing people in public places. I mean, that was Humphrey's defense. I only got, public record information. I didn't delve into anything private. And other people were like, yeah, but that's kind of the spirit was lost when you went to their house. So, there's definitely an ethical conundrum that goes along with these kinds of observational techniques. I think the clinical one is probably the only one that doesn't have the ethical complaint because people are actually coming to the lab. All right. Correlational research. Okay. Now, correlational research is not actually a way of collecting data. It's a way of processing data. So you're going to use data that you got from one of the other research techniques that we've talked about. You're going to do a survey, or you're going to do an observation, or you're going to conduct a case study. And then you're going to look to see whether any of the information that you collected goes along with or predicts any of the other information that you collected. So you're going to use the data from the survey, the case study, or the observation, and you're going to determine whether any of the information that you collected, the variables that you collected, predict each other. Okay. I think it's easiest to discuss this by giving you some examples of actual studies. So, for example, based on survey data, the CDC discovered that, and this is actually has been since at least the 1980s that I know that they keep asking this. People who have more sexual partners tend to contract more STIs. Probably most people know that, right? That the more contacts you have, the more likely you are to actually contract whatever the infectious agent is. So that's a correlation, right? And they've asked people, how many sexual partners have you had? Have you ever had this, that, or the other STI? And so with purely survey methods, we can establish this connection. We can make a prediction that more sexual partners will be associated with more STIs. A person with more STIs, we can predict, probably has had more sexual partners. Now, this next one is a good example from case study kind of research. And this would be people who, as adults, report a homosexual sexual orientation, tend to also report having engaged in more gender atypical play as children than people who have heterosexual orientations as adults. There's a lot of sort of conflict going on right now on these gender atypical play, what that means, what it should or shouldn't mean. I'm not commenting on any of that right now. I'm just telling you that actually this was also from survey data, that the research has very consistently over time shown that there's a higher rate of homosexuality among people who report gender atypical behaviors as children than there is among heterosexuals. Sorry if I said that in the right order. Higher rate of homosexuality than heterosexuality among people who engage in more gender atypical play. So it's a good example of we can make a prediction based on responses to a survey. Here's another good example. I don't know why I didn't do a footnote and I just did a citation, but okay. Couples in long-term relationships tend to share values, opinions, and personalities. So again, you can have a nice survey where you ask, how long have you been in this current committed relationship? And then each partner is asked about their values on different things, their opinions on different things, maybe take a personality scale, stuff like that. And what they find is that long-term relationships tend to be associated with sharing more of these things. Let's break that down. Here we have some people I found on the internet. I don't know these people. I don't know what their relationship is, but I'm going to say that these people have been married since their hair was not gray and that they are still married. I don't know them. I'm just making up a story. So from what I just said in the last example, couple staying together longer is associated with sharing similar values, opinions, and personalities. Okay, so I just transferred that claim or that finding to this picture. Okay, so what I wanted to underscore with this image is that just because two things are correlated does not mean one is causing the other. So it's possible that sharing similar values, opinions, and personality causes the couple to stay together, right? That's possible. But we have what's called a directionality problem, because it's possible that sharing similar values, opinions, and personality causes a couple to stay together. But it's also possible that the longer you stay together, the more in alignment your values, opinions, and personalities will become, right? We don't know from this data. There's no way to tell from that study that I cited earlier. There's no way to know whether sharing values, opinions, and personalities leads to a longer relationship, or if a longer relationship leads to sharing these values. All we know is that they go together. That's all we can say. So using the example of gender atypical play, all we know is that those two things go together. If you thought at all to yourself any kind of causal interpretation, engaging in atypical play makes a person more likely to be homosexual, that's an incorrect conclusion to draw. We don't know that that's how it's going, because it's possible that there's some third variable in play with the gender atypical play and homosexuality, or a third variable present in the example I'm showing here, in sharing similar values, opinions, and personalities, and then staying together. It's possible that having similar backgrounds causes people to have similar values, opinions, and personalities, and makes it more likely that they'll stay together because their family supports the choice, and the community is more supportive of the choice, and a bunch of things that the shared backgrounds might contribute. There might be some third variable that causes gender atypical play and sexual orientation, like, for example, brain structures or hormonal exposures or something else. So when you see that two things go together, or that one thing is predicting another, that does not mean that one is causing the other. If there is a causal relationship, we don't know which way it flows. It's possible that they aren't causing each other at all. And in fact, something else is causing both of them. And so we have to be really super careful about correlational research. All right. And I just have to really belabor that, because so much of research in human sexuality is correlational. Now, there is the occasional experimental research. It's tough to do in human sexuality. I'm going to talk a little bit about a really classic eye-gazing study where they actually randomly, so they had people who didn't know each other, males and females, volunteer for a study, and then they got randomly paired up in male-female pairs, and they were heterosexual dyads, we call them, where one's male, one's female, and they're in a pair. And they were told that they'd been recruited for a study of ESP, extrasensory perception. We're going to see if you guys can read each other's minds. So to get you into alignment, to get you to be, on the same brainwave, half of the participants were told, we need you to stare into each other's eyes until we tell you to stop. And the other half of the participants were told, we need you to stare at each other's hands until we tell you to stop. So the independent variable, the condition that was controlled by the researcher, was where the participants stared, either into each other's eyes or at each other's hands. And then the dependent variable was not ESP. They were not actually interested in whether the couple could actually read each other's minds at the end. At the end, what they did was they took the two into separate rooms, because remember, we're doing this ESP thing. So we're going to put you in separate rooms, and we're going to see if you can read each other's minds. And then at the end, they had to fill out a little survey. And one of the questions on the survey was, how attractive was your partner? And they just rated them on a scale from 1 to 10. So the dependent variable was the score on that attractiveness question. So I've got your groups broken down here where we've got under the independent variable, you've got the experimental group who did the eye gazing, and you've got the control group that stared at the hands. Okay. The dependent variable was actually the attractiveness rating that they gave each other. And what they found is that the people who stared into each other's eyes found their partners on average more attractive than the people who stared at each other's hands. Okay. So you're like, what is this? The hypothesis going in was that eye gazing actually can fuel attraction. And so that's what they were testing. So independent of how attractive the members of the partnership actually were, staring into each other's eyes led to greater attractiveness ratings than staring at each other's hands. So we have a nice little experimental study that shows how important eye gazing is for establishing attraction. So we've got these independent variables and dependent variables. Within the independent variable, we have the groups, either the experimental or the control group. And what we want to see is whether the experimental group scores differently on the dependent variable than the control group does, right? So this is a great way to actually establish cause and effect because the researcher has had control over everything. So the researcher determined who stared into each other's eyes and who stared at each other's hands. And so that takes out any individual differences that the people might have brought with them, individual differences in attraction, like attractiveness, right? So how attractive the individuals were. That's kind of spread out across both groups. That's independent, that's separate. What we're looking at is what the researcher had control over. And it looks like eye gazing, which was more important than anything else in determining how attractive the members of the partnership rated each other. Kind of clever, but it's kind of a good example of how difficult it is to do experimental research in human sexuality, where we have control over everything, right? That's really difficult. So most of our research is going to fall into one of the previous methods that I've been discussing. One of the types of observation, or it's going to be case studies, or it's going to be most of the time surveys. And then that's going to leave us with this kind of correlational data analysis that's going to allow us to see that variables go together, but we can't say that one causes the other because we didn't do an experiment where we controlled everything. Experiments give us control over everything, so we can be really confident that one thing caused another. So it allows for cause and effect conclusions. All right, I just want to wrap up with a little bit of ethics. And, the ethics are the same for us in psychology, regardless of what our actual subject matter is within psychology. So first of all, we want to try and protect our participants from harm as much as we possibly can. So we don't want to expose them to embarrassment. We don't want to expose them to possibly getting fired or, anybody holding something against them in any form. In biological research, we might be concerned about, physical harm. But in psychology, we're generally worried about reputational harm or standing in the community. We also want to make sure that we've secured informed consent where you have to tell them what this study is about. And it doesn't have to be hypotheses or anything that gets ruined, but you have to let them know we're going to be asking you to do this and we're going to ask you to do that. And here are some possible harms that might come from it. Generally, for the research that I do, there's nothing more than everyday life. But in some research, we might have to say that it might make you think about things that are troubling. I've done studies where I ask questions that might make them think about something that has happened in their past inadvertently. It's not what I'm trying to do, but it might cause them to think about it. So it's a potential risk, but we have to inform them of that so that they can make a choice not to participate if they don't want to. If they do start to participate, we have to remind them you can quit anytime you want. So if you start to do it and then you realize, oh, this is what you meant by it might be harmful, I don't want to do this anymore. They are free to take off and not complete it. They do not have to complete it. We don't ever say the experiment demands that you continue. We maintain at the minimum confidentiality. So here we have an example where they're sitting at the same table. So clearly the researcher has seen the person, they know who it is. But don't worry, I will keep all of your responses confidential. If we're doing research on the internet, a lot of times we don't even have to worry about that. We have what's called anonymity. We don't even know exactly who the participants are. So we absolutely can maintain confidentiality for sure. But if we're going to see them face to face, we have to reassure them how we're going to handle their data, make sure that they're comfortable that we're not going to reveal anything personal. And then at the end, we're supposed to provide at least a bare minimums debriefing about basically what we were looking at, but we don't want to ruin hypotheses. And so we don't want to tell every participant what the hypothesis was and what we're expecting to find, because their friend might be signed up to participate in this study or something. And so a lot of times our debriefings are a little bit vague. There were different groups and, some people saw something different than you saw. You want to make sure that they're aware that, this was a legitimate study, that, the outcomes are going to be meaningful, that if we did have to sort of mislead them about our intents, we don't have to reveal that, but we have to make sure that they feel good about what they participated in, so that they don't have to later find out, oh my gosh, you tricked me and you got me to do stuff I wouldn't have done otherwise. You want to make sure that it's clear that everything that you're doing has a purpose. That's basically the goal of the debriefing. It's not to ruin your study so that nobody else can participate in it. It's to make sure that the participants leave the study feeling good about it. So those are our main ethical guidelines that we follow to make sure that we're not harming our participants, and so that they have autonomy and free will as they're participating. Now, we're in human sexuality, so to bring in animal research sounds a little weird, but there are things where we're studying hormones and other kinds of things that we would use animals, and there's a whole separate set of protections for the animals. And we don't do research just because we can. We do research because it's the appropriate and necessary thing. So, there's a whole committee that involves veterinarians and all sorts of things like that for animal research. So, all right, well, that concludes how we study psychology or human sexuality. And so hopefully you guys are ready to soldier on into other topics. I will see you in another chapter.